Wow, this is a video, not a link tree, but if you're here looking for links, the links are down below. For everyone else, this is a rundown of this week's videos. If you want to watch one specifically, check out the link down below, or if you want to watch all of them, they'll all show right after these summaries. First off, I responded to a creator who said that Texas is cheaper to live in than Washington, so that's my response to that. Next up, people in Washington got a little upset that I trashed their roller coaster quality, so there's that video. After that, I respond to a commenter who says that every video showing crime statistics should also show poverty statistics as a form of context. Next up, I talk about terminal velocity, specifically how it relates to the phone that fell 16,000 feet from an airplane and survived. And the last video that I posted was responding to a creator who used the spilled milk analogy for political representatives. Anyway, all these will play after the beep, but if you want to check out one of them specifically, check out the link below.
You guys want to know what really pisses me off? Housing prices down in Texas.
So first off, thank you so much for tagging me in that video. I've been trying to get back to state-by-state videos, but I couldn't really figure out a way to do that organically. But secondly, when he's comparing Texas to Washington, I'm sure you already know this, but there are a lot of stats that he is just not looking into. First off, income. The median income in Washington is about $12,000 higher per year than in Texas, which means the median person in Texas makes $1,000 per month less than the median person in Washington. But that's not all. Electricity is also more expensive in Texas. Same thing with groceries. And when you look at the median income remaining after taxes, rent, food, and power are all taken out, you have a lot less left over in Texas than you do in Washington, even with the lower rent prices. But what this means is if somebody from Washington moved to Texas and kept their income, then they would likely do much better in Texas. But the harsh reality for those growing up in Texas is that they are expected to make considerably less than people in Washington, which means Texas is actually more expensive for them. Not only that, but the violent crime rate is considerably more, the homicide rate is considerably more in Texas. So you're also less likely to have medical insurance in Texas. The risk of gerrymandering is also considerably higher in Texas, which means if you're wanting to vote for change, you're better off in Washington. The list goes on. I will note though that Texas has 32 reputable roller coasters and Washington has a big old goose egg. What are you doing up there, Washington? But aside from that extremely important stat, Texas is losing to Washington in pretty much every important area. And although it may feel like Texas is cheaper on the surface when you're solely looking at rent prices, I promise you if you made the incomes that people in Texas make, it would not be cheaper. It's not a video I'd ever thought I would make, but people in Washington are apparently upset that I rated them poorly on roller coasters. Most of these people are just trying to use Washington's climate as an excuse, like it rains too much. And this person's saying that roller coasters in a temperate rainforest environment, like, no, that's just a bad idea. You guys can keep using that excuse if you want to, but the thing is, you guys have roller coasters that are very successful at those theme parks. This is Wild Thing at Enchanted Forest, which is in Washington. This roller coaster right here is in Washington, and it is very healthy. It's doing just fine. And this is an Aero Looper, which is one of those roller coasters that are slowly dying because they're so old and they're not really that reliable. The thing is, Washington has more examples like these. They have roller coasters. They just don't have any noteworthy roller coasters. So you can keep making up excuses like, oh, Washington has a lot of rain, ignoring the fact that Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee also have a lot of rain, yet they have world-class roller coasters. And you can also talk about the fact that Washington's cold. It's hard to have good roller coasters in the cold, but you know what? Mall of America has good roller coasters, and that's in Minnesota. And you know how they get away with it? They build it inside. Buildings exist. Maybe not in Washington, I guess. You guys have buildings there, right? I'm pretty sure you guys have buildings in Washington. So this person's saying that every video with crime stats should also show poverty levels as a form of context. And this is a pretty popular opinion. In fact, it's what Hank's Razor is about. And if you are familiar with Hank's Razor, it essentially says that anything that could possibly be influenced by socioeconomic status probably is. But the thing is, when you look at crime statistics, socioeconomic status does not necessarily provide the same context as you might think. Because while in areas that have the same or similar legislation, wealthy areas are likely to have less crime than poorer areas, when you start looking at areas with different legislation, it changes drastically. For instance, when we look at it by state, there's a lot of different measurements of socioeconomic status. We can start with income, and when we sort by median household income, that does not necessarily correlate with violent crime levels in those states. And when we look at rent prices, the same thing applies here. And the same thing also applies when you look at food insecurity. There is no correlation state by state. We can even look at the income remaining after taxes, rent, food, and power are all taken out, and the same thing applies. There's no correlation to violent crime. And this is important because if violent crime solely correlated with poverty levels, then this would be the same regardless of which state it's in. This would show up in almost every state regardless of economic factors, regardless of political factors, regardless of environmental factors. If poverty levels correlated with violent crime levels, then this correlation should show up no matter what we sort by. And this correlation should show up when we compare cities, states, even countries. But the thing is, it doesn't. It only shows up when we compare similar areas. And what this means is if you take a group of people all within the same state or city or whatever, and they all have similar or the same legislation governing them, violent crime is likely to happen more in poorer areas than in wealthier areas. But when you sort places by their types of legislation and political affiliation, you'll find that political affiliation actually matters a whole lot more than poverty levels within those areas. And that's largely because states with differing political affiliations likely have different laws that affect things like firearm ownership. The lawmakers in those states are more or less likely to get money from gun rights activists and private prisons. They also have different legislations around protecting people like the trans community and the LGBTQ+ community from hate crimes. So in the end, while crime is absolutely correlated with poverty in specific areas, it is by no means solely correlated with socioeconomic status. There are a lot of differing factors, and many of those factors actually affect violent crime more than poverty. There have been a few people trying to correct me about that last physics video. A lot of them are trying to say that I am saying that not everything falls at the same rate, and technically that's true. If you remember taking science classes in high school, you know that gravity affects pretty much everything the exact same. So if you drop two items, both of them weighing two different weights, and they were unobstructed by anything including the Earth's atmosphere, they would both land at the exact same time. But this is only true if those two objects are unobstructed, which means air resistance can get in the way. And in fact, when an object is free falling, there is actually a max speed that it can naturally go when headed towards the ground. This speed is called terminal velocity, and it can change not only based on the object, but based on how thick the atmosphere is. It might also change depending on the orientation of the falling object, which means if the object is spinning, the terminal velocity might be variable. And many of us actually already know this subconsciously. If you took an empty soda can and dropped it at the same time as a full soda can over a long distance, you probably already know that the full soda can will arrive at the ground faster. And the same is true for small objects like smartphones. That iPhone that fell 16,000 feet from an airplane and survived likely did so because it hit terminal velocity and then fell somewhere soft. But terminal velocity wasn't the only thing saving it, as I showed in the math from last video. Because iPhones are made out of very dense materials like stainless steel, titanium, and aluminum. These iPhones are also a lot smoother than a lot of cheap plastic phones, which means when they're falling, they can fight the air a lot better. And as a result, they can move a lot faster when they fall.
The problem that I'm having with politics lately is it doesn't feel like either side is actually trying to solve problems. They're just trying to convince me that all the problems were caused by the other side. Like, I don't care who spilt the milk at this point, guys. I want somebody to clean it up.
Okay, videos like these are the reason why people feel validated for not being educated about politics. First, let's acknowledge the whole spilled milk metaphor, which implies that both parties agree that the milk needs to be cleaned up to begin with. And this, of course, is not true. If you know anything about politics, you know that this is the primary reason why we're politically divided. Should the milk be cleaned up? That's going to take paper towels. Is it worth the tax dollars to buy those paper towels? Why should the milk be cleaned up if we're not going to use the countertop? Let the person who's going to use the countertop clean it up. Secondly, in politics, it is important to find out who spilled the milk because we're quite literally electing the people whose job it is to hold it. Finding out who spilled the milk at breakfast doesn't really matter because nobody really wants to spill the milk. That's not their goal. And plus, everybody has access to the milk. It could have been anybody. But in politics, it's important to find out who spilled the milk because they don't just make their own breakfast with it, they make ours too. They literally only have two jobs: keep it from spilling and clean up the milk when it spills. The idea that we shouldn't care which representative spilled the milk is how we got to the situation with the spilled milk to begin with. Thirdly, listening to politicians bicker about who spilled the milk is not the only way to find out who actually did. We have voting records, we have court documents, we can watch them live on TV. If you think about a specific milk spill, you can actually go back and look to see who was holding the gallon when it happened. You can also see who's trying to clean up the milk and who's stopping them from doing it. Take dark money in politics as an example. That situation was largely caused by the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Supreme Court. This is what that court looked like at the time. You can very clearly see who was holding that milk. And on the flip side, there have been many bills introduced to clean up the milk from the Citizens United decision. And you can go and look to see which candidates introduced those bills. Next point, people aren't political parties. Implying that all views from every single representative of a political party aligns 100% with that party is just inaccurate. AOC has completely different views than Joe Manchin. While we do have two sides, both sides have a wide variety of candidates and as a result, a wide variety of political views. Some representatives spend more time talking about cleaning up the milk, some spend more time talking about who spilled it. On the Republican side, you can look at Chris Christie, who spends more time talking about cleaning up the milk, and then you can look at Donald Trump, who spends more time talking about who spilled it. Lastly, it's important to understand that videos that spark fear and rage get the most attention because they get the most engagement and they get boosted and are seen by more people. We have a strong sample bias. People get mad and fearful when talking about blame. People are more calm and thoughtful when talking about solutions, and that does not boost videos. That does not create engagement. Videos and quotes and interviews about blame go way further than videos about solutions. As a result, that's all we see, but that's not all that's out there. As a voter, you have to put in the work if you want solutions to these problems. And if you're responsible as a content creator, you should be providing those solutions and educating voters about how they can participate in them. Justifying the claim that bills aren't being introduced to fix these problems is not just flagrantly false. It also validates political apathy, which makes these problems even worse. Also, as a side note, I know I'm supposed to be taking a break from political content, but some things just need to be said.